and off we go.
Okay, just get that up on the screen.
So I can see it here, it's all good.
I'll just get the slideshow going. Everyone can see that okay?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, thanks everyone. Yeah, thanks for coming along. And as we've already been discussing, very busy time leading up to Christmas, and obviously everyone was dealing with all the COVID situations at their own work and personal lives. So as Frank said, I'm with GHD. I have been an energy and carbon management consultant for about 25 years. Prior to that, came out of a corporate environmental role. And yes, this issue of net zero or decarbonisation or emissions reduction is critical, and critical whether you're a small business or whether you're a large business or a large corporate. So I'll just do an acknowledgement of country before we start. So we acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners of all lands throughout Australia on which we do business, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. A quick outline of what we're going to cover off today. I'm going to start big and then drill down to what it means for businesses and what you can do about this. So I'll move through the first couple of sections fairly quickly, and then we'll concentrate on that net zero roadmap section, and then we'll open up for discussion and questions at the end. So we'll do some scene setting, look at the context, and then work out also what are some of the support mechanisms that are available, particularly at the federal and state government level in New South Wales for businesses as they're trying to put together or implement their net zero roadmaps. As Frank's mentioned, COP26 recently finished up. A lot of media around that. I guess the key points to look at there is that in the statement at the end of COP26, it was the first one to mention phasing down of fossil fuels, and especially with reference to coal. And whilst some of the wording was changed at the last minute from phase out to phase down, that was a critical development in the statement coming out at the end of the annual COP. It also set up the mechanism to allow a lot of the regional emissions trading schemes to be linked internationally. So that's going to support international carbon trading. Another key development and report that came out in the last 12 months was that by the International Energy Agency, and they have put together their net zero roadmap for the energy industry and energy users. And whilst it is quite a detailed and ambitious document, I mean, one of the headlines was that there was no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in our net zero pathway. So that was quite a surprise to many who've watched some of the reports that have come out of IEA over the last sort of 10 years or so, but a real change in the rhetoric and a real change in the focus from the IEA. Also at the international level, and this is more for Australian industries who are exporting into the EU, they are going to be implementing what they call a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the CBAM. And this is essentially to equalise the carbon price that member organisations within the EU would be paying for imports coming from countries that don't currently have a similar scheme. So initially targeting heavy industry and emissions intensive goods such as cement, aluminium, fertiliser, iron and steel. Because the key thing there is that the current ETS trading scheme is trading at about 67 euros per tonne, which I think last time I checked was about 104 Australian dollars per tonne. So a significant price on carbon for imports into the EU is coming in the near future. And finally, there are a number of carbon offset and emissions, on carbon offset and certificate schemes available at the international level. And these can be developed or utilised in Australia to look at offsetting emissions, or you can even tap into those for generating your own certificates from various projects. And we'll talk about this at there's these international carbon offset schemes, and then there's obviously federal ones in Australia and state-based ones in New South Wales. So I'll touch on those. One of the interesting points about this particular one I've highlighted here is that in the VER scheme, it also combines other non-carbon benefits from an initiative. So in this case, this is a West Australian project that I've highlighted here. It was also looking at some of the broader biodiversity and environmental benefits that this particular scheme was offering, and then bundled it up into, I guess, carbon value and broader environmental value, and then people can use it, can look at generating or purchasing offsets in a scheme like that. Okay. Just a little bit of background noise. If everyone can just mute their microphones at the moment. Be great. I've just highlighted this this particular graphic here. This is from the International Agency Net Zero report. And don't get too concerned about the detail, but what it is, it's mapping out the way they see that we can get, or the energy industry, energy supply can get to net zero by 2050. And as I said, it's very ambitious. If you look even at in 2021, no new unabated coal plants approved for development. And then down the bottom here, no new oil and gas fields approved for development, and no new coal mines or mine extensions. So obviously they're extremely bullish objectives that they see are necessary to achieve net zero by 2050. Other, I guess, recent developments in the past couple of years has been, I guess, shareholder activism and also legal challenges, particularly focused at public companies and large companies, and those in the fossil fuel industry in particular. So recently, Shell, Exxon, and Chevron have all been caught up in either legal challenges or shareholder activism, demanding that they take more ambitious or put together more ambitious targets and initiatives around decarbonisation and net zero and emissions reductions. Locally, Santos has been targeted by the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, and they're targeting them, I guess, on two fronts: whether they've breached corporations and consumer law about how they describe natural gas as a fuel, in that they are suggesting that it is or they're not suggesting, they are stating it as a clean energy. And the other one is that there is, according to this particular case, there is a gap between the targets and objectives that Santos has set out and the plan to achieve it. And this is a really important point. I mean, it's called, the credibility gap, whereby an organisation may state a target or a goal to achieve net zero by a certain date, but they don't have a thorough plan to achieve that. So that goes to, I guess, the key point we're covering off today, which is your net zero plan or your emissions reduction plan. Coming back to Australia at the federal level, as you would know, we set a net zero target by 2050 prior to COP26, but we are sticking with our 26 to 28% reduction by 2030. That is not considered ambitious enough by the international community, and Australia, amongst other countries, will be asked to go back and refresh and revise that target in 2022. On the funding front, the Australian government obviously is very technology focused. They're talking about technology, not taxes. So they have in the order of 20 billion set aside under various schemes, delivered mainly through Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, and also bodies such as ARENA, Clean Energy Finance Corporation. One recent example is the, I think it was only 2 weeks ago now, the announcement about a feasibility or support for a feasibility study for the Port of Newcastle Hydrogen Hub. Stepping down to some of the support programs available, I mean, the National Greenhouse Energy Reporting Scheme, or NGERS, whilst not a support program as such, it is a mechanism for those large emitters to report their emissions. And it's being modified at the moment to allow organisations to actually incorporate their progress against voluntary reduction and emissions reduction programs. And you'll be able to track, or people will be able to track a organisation's performance against their own targets through the National Greenhouse Energy Reporting System. Another one which is probably more relevant to a lot of the people here today is the Climate Active Carbon Neutral Program. So this is a federal government program which span out of the National Carbon Offset Scheme. So it is an initiative which allows organisations or their products and services they offer to be certified as carbon neutral. So, and we'll look at some of the initiatives that you need to go through to achieve that, but essentially you need to set your baseline, you need to look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So looking upstream and downstream of your organisation. And then you have to have an emissions reduction plan. And then finally, looking at offsetting any remaining emissions. And then that process gets audited before you can make your claim to being carbon neutral under that scheme. People are probably familiar with the renewable energy targets and the renewable energy certificates. So 2 schemes there. Large initiatives for greater than 100 kilowatt generation capacity and small for less than 100 kilowatt. Because the key thing here, and I'll look at it in a slide in a second, is the value of those certificates. With the significant increase in supply of renewable energy in the last few years, the target for meeting the renewable energy target should have seen that the prices have dropped below what they are currently trading, which is around $34 per LGC. So it's probably indicative of people entering the market to buy those certificates as an offset mechanism for their own requirements. So that price is sitting at higher than what would have been expected if it was purely the regulatory requirement for the surrender of those certificates each year by the energy retailers. The other initiative, and it is essentially our de facto carbon price at the moment, is the Australian Carbon Credit Units. So this is under the Emissions Reduction Fund, or the old Carbon Farming Initiative. And it allows organisations to generate certificates under a range of schemes: energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, soil sequestration, etc. And then it is a voluntary program. So then it can be, the certificates can then be sold, and then people can use them to offset their emissions via this Australian certified scheme. So opportunities there for generating certificates, and also people who are looking to offset their emissions. Then you can use the ACCUs to do that. Okay, at the state government level, the New South Wales government has been very ambitious in the last few years around net zero. So they have their own net zero target by 2050, and recently increased their 2030 target from 35% to 50% reduction. So that is really setting the scene, and I guess setting the pace of development in this area in New South Wales. And then government policy and programs and funding flows from that net zero target. So the current plan is out to 2030. So a lot of the initiatives are focused on that first 10 years of that 2020 to 2050 program. So looking at funding and support mechanisms. A lot of the funding at the moment is under this Net Zero Industry and Innovation Fund. There's about 750 million available, and it's divided into 3 separate areas. And at the moment, there is an EOI out, which we'll be responding to. And they see this as a template, and I think it would be we're looking to apply it across other regions within New South Wales. So it's the Hunter Clean Manufacturing Precinct Decarbonisation Roadmap. It has a couple of key elements. It's looking at taking the heavy industry, heavy emitters, hard to abate sectors, and decarbonisation plans for those industries, and then also trying to grow that clean tech and solution provider. So hence the clean manufacturing precinct, so that we have this sort of integration on this ecosystem whereby we've got solution providers and service providers in there working with the heavy industry to provide solutions and to deliver on that decarbonisation roadmap. So that process is starting at the moment. EOI closes next week, and I think there is one also in the Illawarra, and they would see that is an example of the types of initiatives that will be funded under this Net Zero Industry Innovation Fund. Support program in New South Wales. There's not a lot of direct funding at the moment, but under the Sustainably Advantaged program, they are about to renew that panel, which can support businesses who join up to Sustainably Advantaged. And one of the key offerings within that support initiative will be net zero support. So they ran a pilot this year, looking at supporting companies to develop a net zero roadmap. So that will continue with the new panel starting next year. And it may even kick off before then, but there's been no announcement yet as to when that would start. Other initiatives, I mean, if organisations are in, I guess, the energy storage or renewable energy space, New South Wales government has offered funding under FES, or pumped hydro energy storage, looking at feasibility for increasing the storage capacity locally and also in conjunction with their renewable energy zones. At the at the certificate level in New South Wales, it's not a carbon certificate scheme similar to the ones we've looked at already, but it's an energy management program. So the New South Wales Energy Security Safeguard allows organisations to generate these energy saving certificates, or ESCIs. And once again, their price has increased significantly in the last 12 months, currently trading at around about $37 per ESCI. So this is for energy saving, and then it places, I guess, a de facto value upon the carbon saving as well, but it's for energy saving initiatives. So equipment upgrades, mainly focused on medium to large scale projects, although there are some sort of deemed certificate programs that pick up smaller upgrades and smaller initiatives. One of the key things about this program is that for large scale projects, you're allowed to forward create your certificates. So if you have, I don't know, the replacement of a large compressor, for example, you may be able to generate certificates for the 10 years worth of savings, and then you apply certain discount factors. But if you're able to model the energy consumption beforehand, do the upgrade, and then you model the outcomes, then you can generate usually about sort of 8 years worth of savings. And you can essentially bring that saving up front. So you'll get your energy saving from doing the project, and then you can also monetize that saving as well in this scheme, the Energy Security Safeguard Scheme. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. Don't worry about this green line at the top. That's the Victorian scheme. But the two ones I wanted to focus on really were the energy certificate scheme, or the energy saving scheme I just mentioned. So it was trading at about $28 a year ago, and is now up to sort of about 37, as I mentioned. So significant price increase there. Of more importance probably is this bottom orange line. So this is the Australian Carbon Credit Unit's prices. So quite stable over recent times. It was trading usually $16 to $18 per ACCU. And then we could just see this significant increase since the middle of the year, up to the moment where it's trading up around that sort of $37, $38. So as I said, this is kind of like our de facto carbon price in Australia at the moment. And for organisations that are wanting to do something like a shadow carbon price or an internal carbon price, this is probably the figure that you want to be looking at. Because at the moment, if you wanted to offset your emissions through an Australian generated program, it would be through ACCUs. So that's the sort of price you're looking at. So, and this really does lend itself to looking at the demand for these voluntary offset certificates in the market at the moment. Okay, I moved through that fairly quickly. There may be some questions, but we'll grab them at the end. So I wanted to start talking really about the net zero process at the moment and what it means. I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, a net zero plan, an emissions reduction plan, a decarbonisation plan or strategy, they're all quite similar. Obviously, the difference with net zero is that you have a specific target that you want to achieve, which is net zero emissions, by a particular date. Whereas an emissions reduction plan may be that you are going to just reduce your emissions gradually over the next 10, 20, 30 years, whatever that may be. The net zero component obviously aligns with international expectations and then also federal and state government initiatives as well. So that net zero by 2050 is the date that people are working towards. What has happened, I guess, in the last 12, 18 months, 2 years, though, is the real focus on 2030. And this decade, 2020 to 2030, is seen as the time period we have to make significant reductions in our emissions. As we saw, New South Wales has a 50% target, the EU has 55%, and other countries have similar targets along those lines. So the 2030 timeline is really the critical one. So when putting together your plan, it's that what can I achieve in the next 10 years is really going to be a critical focus. Yes, beyond to 2050 is important, but out to 2030 is going to be the critical one. So this slide here talks about the scopes of emissions. Most organisations, when they're talking about net zero, are talking about scope 1, their direct emissions physically occurring within their facility or within their control for company vehicles, plus scope 2, which is usually imported electricity. Emissions happening at the power station, but the consumption of electricity happens at your site. So you're looking at scope 1 and scope 2. So for these, when you're pulling together your emissions baseline, you're looking at utility bills largely. So natural gas, fuel, depending on your operation, there may be other direct emissions occurring here, and then your electricity bills here. So that's allowing you to put together that first part of that emissions profile. The second part is this, I guess, and is the more difficult one. It's the relevant scope 3. And scope 3 is essentially everything else upstream and downstream of your organization. So your supply chain upstream, and then downstream, transport, distribution, use and disposal of your product or service, broken down into these categories here that you need to look at. Now, depending on if you did want to align your initiatives with a particular scheme, and key international one is science-based targets. The key local one is climate active, as I've said. Climate active asks you to look at relevant scope 3, and that test is, well, what are some of these categories compared to my scope 1 and scope 2? So that's the relevance test for there. For for science-based targets, scope 3, if they're greater than 40% of your total emissions, you're required to include that in your emissions reduction targets. Okay, what is the process for putting together a net zero roadmap or an emissions reduction plan, or whatever it is that you want to call it, whatever goal that you have for your organisation? The first step really is looking at why you're doing it. So what's the context? What are the drivers? So it's looking at what's happening within your industry, what's happening with regard to regulations. So what is in particular, New South Wales state government doing in this area? What are your shareholders, customers, and other stakeholders expecting of and competitors, expecting that you'll be doing in this area? So that's a key part, because that really sets the scene and also will inform your choice around how quickly you need to decarbonize, how quickly you need to reach that net zero goal. Is it in 2030 or 2035, or is it in 2040 or 2050? So really important step. So getting together with key stakeholders, probably a two-step process really. You're looking internally, you'll get together with the key people within your organization as to determine why you're doing this, what are your drivers. And then depending on relationships with external stakeholders, you would probably be engaging with them as well. So obviously suppliers and customers will be key in that, but it could be local community. If you're a public organization, then obviously you'll be looking at what are shareholders expecting of you. And a critical piece too, if you're a public company, is what investors are expecting. And the investment market is becoming extremely active in this space. And their expectations on public corporations are growing significantly. And they want to see action, they want to see a plan, and they want to see a robust risk assessment as to what the impacts of climate change are going to be on your business. So that's where this framework, this is the Task Force on Climate Change Related Financial Disclosure, really pitched at public corporations. However, it can be applied by any organisation. It's looking at what are the physical risks that you'll be exposed to with climate change? What's going to happen to your supply chain? What are the expectations, again, of your customers, shareholders, other stakeholders? What are the financial risks that you can see with energy prices or carbon prices coming to bear? If you're an exporter of, cement or aluminium, are you exporting to the EU? And are you going to be hit by this carbon border adjustment mechanism? So that risk assessment up front is really critical to, again, setting the boundaries and expectations of what your net zero plan has to achieve. We've run a number of diagnostics or self-assessments that go through just a basic checklist that you would sit down and say, okay, where are we at on these issues? It could be, targets, could be objectives. Do you have emissions reduction opportunities already identified? What are you doing with your energy procurement program, etc.? So allows you to go through and look at gaps you may have in putting together, so in your I guess your current response, and then looking at where you want to be and what those steps might be to get there. As I mentioned before, critical in putting together your net zero roadmap is where are you today? So making sure that you have a clear definition of your boundary, as I said, has to include scope 1 and scope 2, but then are you going to be also looking beyond that to scope 3? And the area of inclusion of scope 3 emissions is getting a lot of focus, particularly from activists, but also from investors and other stakeholders. I mean, if your good that you're producing, for example, uses energy in its life once it's sold, then obviously the emissions from the use and of that energy via the product or the good needs to be looked at as part of your emissions profile. Whether you include it in your target, that will be up to you in terms of risk assessment and expectations upon your business. So making sure that scope is clear and the boundaries then allows you to develop your emissions baseline. And from that, you can then forecast where your emissions may be going in the future. So the emissions baseline, scope 1 and scope 2, is relatively straightforward. Although if you're a multi-site operation, then it can be a bigger exercise, but spreadsheet models are fine for that. And if you've done work in this area in the past, if you've done energy audits, etc., then you should have a lot of this information. Obviously, your accounts will have all of the various invoices, so it can be gathered fairly easily. The forecasting section is probably a little bit trickier. So that's where you'll be looking at, okay, if I do nothing from this day forward, what's going to happen to my emissions as my business grows? And so you'll be applying an activity indicator. It may be a production indicator, it may be sales, or a combination of the two, to forecast where you think your emissions will go in the future if you do nothing. So, and obviously that gets trickier the further you go out in the future, but as I said, the focus initially will be on up to 2030. A lot of businesses will be breaking down their timelines into 5-year blocks. So 2020 to 25, 2025 to 2030, for example, and then going on out to 2050. And you would revise this forecast as you get better information as you go on. Once you've established where you are now and where you think you're going, the next step really is to look at, okay, what can I do about it? So emissions reduction opportunities. Your first port of call will always be, how can I reduce the emissions that I am currently generating from my business activities? The focus will mainly be on what you can do within your own operation, but it could be, if your scope 3 emissions are a significant portion, you're engaging with your suppliers or you're engaging with your customers to look at, or you're engaging with research institutions, for example, looking at a supply chain approach to look at what can I do to reduce emissions. So that's the first lever that you can pull. And it could be, energy management initiatives. It could be fuel switching to cleaner fuels. And as we've highlighted earlier, there may well be some funding that's available. There may well be certificates you could generate from those emissions reduction projects that helps you reduce the cost of actually doing that upgrade or making that change. One thing quickly on emissions reduction also is that, or carbon offsets, is that if you are generating a project that then generates these certificates, you can monetize them for a period of time. Let's say you have a target for 2030. you do a project, it's then giving you savings for, say, the 10 years from 2025 to 2035. You could monetize the savings for the first 5-year period. And then when your target comes in at 2030, then you're doing a voluntary surrender of those and you're using those to offset your emissions to meet your own target. So there's flexibility there. The next thing you'll probably look at will be on-site renewables. So depending on roof space, land space, etc. Mainly this will be in solar PV. And then grid purchase renewables and or looking at your procurement. So something like a power purchase agreement with a renewable energy provider. One thing to think about in this section here is that unless you're also buying those large generation certificates, the LGCs that I mentioned earlier, you cannot claim, even if it's energy that is from a wind farm or a solar farm, unless you're also buying those certificates that are attached with it, you cannot claim that it is zero emissions energy, because another party may well be buying those certificates and they're claiming the reduction. So just important when you're looking at things like PPAs, if you don't have the LGCs attached to it, essentially it's just a hedge. So you're just locking into a power purchase agreement to give you a price of energy going forward for usually sort of 10 years. The final piece of the puzzle is carbon offsets. And depending on your risk assessment and the expectations of your stakeholders that you're identifying up in this first part of it, it may be that carbon offsets play a major part in what you're doing, but it may be that they only play a very small part. The thing about carbon offsets is that you need to buy these every year. So for every ton of CO2 you're emitting, you need to buy an offset every year to eliminate that. So it is certainly a viable part of the program, and it may be that it plays a larger part whilst you're then getting your emissions reduction initiatives up and running, and then plays a smaller part in the future. Or you go through this process and over time you drive down your emissions as far as you can, and then you purchase your carbon offsets for that last piece. Just checking the time. From this, if you want, you can generate a marginal abatement cost curve, and I'll show you an example of those in a minute. Once we've got these initiatives in place, you can start to do some scenario analysis. So you've got your business as usual that you've already done. You then start looking at, okay, how fast do I want to try and reduce my emissions? And you can run scenarios whereby you're doing more than what you are for business as usual, but you're not doing that much more. And then you might be doing what is expected of your industry. And then you might run another scenario that says, okay, I'm going to be a leader. And so I'm going to drive this process really hard to drive down my emissions over that time. And then critical is that you've got agreement within your organization that that's the pathways that you're going to do. And this process is iterative. You will come back and review this, I think, at least on a 12-monthly basis, because all of this stuff is going to change. Expectations will change, energy prices will change, technology prices will change, carbon offset prices will change. So this is a process whereby you're coming back and revisiting on a regular basis to make sure it's still appropriate. What does it look like? Well, this is a breakdown of an emissions baseline for an organization. This was for a water organization. So what is scope 1 for them? They have direct emissions from fugitives, they have vehicle fuel emissions, and then they have stationary fuel emissions, so natural gas and others that they're using. Scope 2 is their imported electricity, and then they have this selection of scope 3. So for them, that was the appropriate, I guess, categories of scope 3 to include. And it may be that an organisation starts with a grouping of scope 3, and over time they expand that to include more categories, either when the data becomes available or expectations change on what they're meant to do. From the organisation's perspective, 30% scope 1, so these ones over here, 70% scope 2. So that's imported electricity. So again, when you're looking at emissions reduction opportunities, driving down electricity is going to reduce their biggest current category of emissions. And then you've got looking at fugitive emissions over here. So for them, changing their wastewater treatment process, capturing methane, either flaring it or using it to generate electricity would be an option, for example. The process that they went through, or we went through with them, to come up with their reduction opportunities. Started out with greater than 200, qualitative assessment, pass fail, quantitative assessment to look at, okay, what's the scope and scale of the emissions reduction, making sure that it ticks all the boxes from a risk perspective, and then prioritizing those. So you'll probably come up with a list that there might be some quick wins, still some low-hanging fruit. Then you'll have some sort of medium scale projects in terms of capital, and then you might have some real transformative type projects that require a longer time frame, may well be accessing grant funding. It may involve, other parties to really assist you to work out what is what are those larger projects going to look like. I mentioned the marginal abatement cost curve, or MAC curve. This is just a default example. This is taken from what McKinsey did quite a few years back. If you haven't seen one of these before, it's looking at plotting the various emissions reduction opportunities on a chart. So these ones on the left-hand side with a negative dollars per CO2 are actually saving you money. And this is like an industry-wide one. So you can see that you've got initiatives that are very much in the negative territory in terms of what it costs. So therefore, they're actually saving you money, through to those which are costing you money for every ton of emissions that you are trying to abate. So obviously, you want to be trying to get as many as you can in this area, high value abatement, and minimizing the ones in this section here. So from your emissions reduction opportunity review, you would be able to plot your opportunities on a chart like this, and again, allowing you to focus and seeing it as to which ones you should be concentrating on. Obviously, if you're doing NPV, IRR, or even simple payback, including a carbon price, definitely do include an internal carbon price, so you get a full understanding of what the savings are. Because if you're reducing emissions over here, you don't have to go and purchase offsets over here. And then your scenarios. So in this case, looking at 5 potential scenarios, but this would be sort of a business as usual. Then you've got like a minimum compliance, and then leader, or a trying to drive down your emissions significantly in that period out to 2030, and then continuing along through to 2050. And again, you may not have projects that are beyond 2030, that they're still to be recognised and identified. So you would expect that there may still be some gaps in terms of getting to net zero, but you would expect that hopefully with technology advancements, cost changes, etc., you'll be able to bring in more projects to drive down that line as the time goes on. Again, critical. If 2030 is a key date for you, you say, well, what is the gap? Does it mean that I need to purchase offsets if I'm going to be net zero by 2030 for that gap? Just a quick example of some of the similar projects that we've worked on in recent years. And again, they've been had different drivers. Some of them have been around sort of looking at designing new initiatives and new projects, built environment for net zero, or high efficiency buildings, for example. Others have been looking at developing a net zero strategy or a carbon roadmap. So, and you can see there from the range of different organisations that we've been engaging with, it is across the board in terms of industry sectors: food, utilities, buildings, transport, infrastructure, local governments and councils. So businesses are in a lot of cases scrambling to keep up with expectations because they have increased so much in the last couple of years. But there is a process you can go through to do it. And I guess one other thing to keep in mind too is if you're in that supply chain, you're sorry? Yep. If you're in that supply chain, it may be that you start getting asked some very hard questions at very short notice. So having a plan together will be really important in being able to respond to that. The food and beverage supply chain is a really good example. The Coles and Woolworths of the world have their own targets that they are setting, and that is flowing through that entire supply chain in terms of what they expect from suppliers. So if you haven't been asked already, it's probably only a matter of time. One more thing, just quickly, whilst we've been very much focused on climate change and decarbonisation and net zero, I mean, sustainability is, as you know, much broader than that, although, climate change and our response is critical piece. A number of businesses, particularly larger businesses, but not necessarily only larger businesses, are looking at how they respond to a whole range of sustainability requirements, and going through the Sustainable Development Goals and looking at which ones you believe you can have most impact upon is a process that a number of businesses have gone through recently. So it may be that from our 16, 17 goals here, you might choose 3 or 5 or 7 or something to really concentrate on and have specific programs in place to respond. Obviously with net zero, we're talking about number 13 down here, climate action, and to a certain extent also linking into affordable and clean energy. But it also has other links and flow-on effects in terms of impacts on the environment more broadly, as well as, obviously economic and social impacts as well. Okay, that was a fair bit of information. I've raced through most of that. Any questions?
Any questions? I know I've just gone in the chat. Peter Morrissey sort of jumping in there. He must have reception problems. He was saying if we have a 50% target in New South Wales, how much reduction is that? So I'm not sure what if you can answer that question.
I don't know what it is in terms of millions of tonnes. I can come back with a figure. I mean, that's the state. That's what the state government is driving towards for the state of New South Wales. So it isn't just government organisations. It's what the expectation is for New South Wales. And you may have seen some of the discussion recently in terms of, well, should the federal government increase their 2030 target? I mean, and they expect that we will probably achieve nationally in the order of a 35% reduction in emissions. A lot of that is being driven by what's happening at the state government level and what's happening at private organisations as well. So they're key contributors, because every state and territory, I'm pretty sure, has their own net zero by 2050 target, and most of them have a 2030 target. New South Wales obviously does, Victoria does as well. And so those initiatives and that investment that they're putting in is really, bubbling up to what's happening at the national level. And so the targets we're talking about are usually coming back to 2005 as a baseline. So for an individual company, you need to look at when you would set your baseline. For something like that climate active program I was talking about, it's sort of got to be in the last couple of years that you're setting your baseline, and it should be a baseline which could be difficult for some businesses because of COVID, that reflects your normal operations. So it's not going to be a super high year or a super low year. It's meant to be like a normal year's baseline, because then that's what you're measuring yourself against in terms of your emissions reduction, and then any carbon offsets that you need to purchase going forward to achieve your net zero.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from anyone?
Yeah, Frank.
Yep.
Yeah, Graham from Chamberlain Group.
Yes, Graham.
Yeah, so we've calculated our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for our Gosford facility.
Mm-hmm.
We used a baseline in 2019, pre-COVID. Like you said, find a nice normal year to do it.
Yep.
If we were to certify net zero in a couple of years, is it just on scope 1 and 2? Or are they going to ask for some specific scope 3?
Yeah, again, if you're looking at Australia, I mean, the only scheme really is the Climate Active Carbon Neutral scheme. So that allows you to certify either your organisation or a product or service, or there are other elements. There's events and the like, buildings, etc. So that will look at your scope 1 and scope 2, and then relevant scope 3. So again, that's the relevance test. So you need to go through and say, well, what are these range of, well, so firstly, you identify the range of scope 3 categories that you think are most important to your business, depending on upstream and downstream emissions. And the example I gave of, if you're manufacturing a product, that then consumes energy downstream, then you probably need to look at the emissions from the use of that product as one of your scope 3 categories. So it's that relevance test. So, and it depends from business to business. So, I mean, the Science-Based Targets Initiative says that if scope 3 emissions in total are greater than 40%, you need to include those emissions. For the climate active one, it is more about what's the scale of those scope 3 or those categories of scope 3 compared to your scope 1 and scope 2. There isn't, to go back and check the regulation, not the regulation, the guidelines. I mean, if it's greater than 10%, for example, for a particular scope 3, then you would need to be sort of including that in your scope 1 and scope 2. I mean, sorry, I mean, the example I gave before about, I think it was 12% of emissions for that water authority were scope 3. Then obviously they've identified that that was a large enough portion of their scope 1 and scope 2 to include that in their target and their baseline.
Okay. No, thanks for that information. So we need to go get some more specific answers to our industry and our company.
Yeah, yeah.
And okay.
I mean, scope 3 emissions is an area that is getting a lot of focus, and a lot of organisations have in the past been focusing on scope 1 and scope 2. I mean, it's the ones you're directly responsible, it's the ones you can most easily manage, but they really are trying to push organisations to say, okay, well, what's happening upstream and downstream where you can engage or influence? So it is usually harder to deal with them. In most cases, harder to deal with them, but I guess they're encouraging that sort of, supply chain type thinking. Okay, what if we did something different in terms of choosing our raw materials? Or what if we worked with, the way people used our product downstream, that it resulted in less emissions?
And I guess the complicated part is not duplicating your emissions calculation, because scope 3, the other company or your supplier should be including it in their scope 1 or 2.
Yeah, exactly. So from an accounting perspective, yes, you're only looking at your scope 1 and scope 2 as your emissions. This goes to, I guess, that broader concept. So you're right, so your scope 3 is someone else's scope 1, essentially. So from an accounting perspective, yes, that needs to be clear that they're also accounting for that, and you would expect that they would be. It's more of that area in between and looking at that collaboration and cooperation and engagement, whereby you're looking at that broader perspective across the board. And assuming if it's a customer downstream that is using your product, that is your scope 3, then you're expecting them to be engaging with you as a supplier, because that's their scope 3, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the answer and great presentation.
No worries, thanks.
Ian, did you want to add something? I had your hand up.
Yeah, so I like everyone. I'm Ian Dixon. I'm the local manager for GHD on the Central Coast. I also work in the sustainability industry, but mainly in the design of new assets and infrastructure. I guess it's probably an open question. I guess it's more, I'm just interested to know how many CCIC members have actually, defined a net zero target or are in the process of actually considering doing so for their business.
Has anyone defined a target, or that's why you're here?
Graham again. So we have set ours a few months ago, and we did set it for 2030, but now we're just learning more. We could be a lot more aggressive on achieving that goal, but it's a constant learning curve about this whole process.
Yeah, I mean, this presentation certainly, even for me, has opened up, a lot of information, things that I wasn't aware of. So I think it is, for a large business, they've probably got people resourced, but for a smaller business, it's a challenge. And to some extent, it looks a bit complex, but you keep it simple, I suppose, is the philosophy. And what are you doing now? I think once you identify where you're at today, then that really gives you the opportunity to see what you can do, and be able to leverage off what other people are doing as well, and understand, having that network and that collaboration to share ideas in terms of being able to improve your position from a net zero perspective.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, the program I mentioned before, the Net Zero pilot program that Sustainability Advantage ran this year, get my years confused, was it's a really good introduction to how to deal with this, and it goes through largely the process and provides support for the process I've outlined today. It's I don't believe that they have released it to a full support program yet, but it's certainly going to be a key one that's part of their program going forward. At the latest, kicking off next year in July. So, I mean, that's a good initiative. I mean, it's probably, particularly for larger, more complex organisations, it's probably just a starting point, and you're probably only going to be able to scratch the surface. But that's a good initiative. So, yeah, that's through Sustainability Advantage.
Any other questions from one's mindful of time? So it sounds like a few of the businesses we've got online probably need to do a bit of work in this space to develop their position. And a big on small, I think it's a great thing to do, and not only to support the environment, but it's good, makes a lot of good business sense as well, and does position your business in a very strong light from an environmental perspective. So I think, yeah, it was a great presentation. Like I said, for me, and I've been involved in this space, not fully, but it certainly made some complex things look a lot simpler. And I note Matt Hingerty's comment about that as well. And he's dealing with this stuff every day, so which is great. So last call, anyone just right just after 1:30. Any other questions or comments before I close off?
If anyone has any questions or any on the presentation, yeah, please drop me a note. I'm happy to respond, and I think Frank will be sharing it. Are we?
Yeah. So we'll share the presentation, but also because we had about half a dozen people who couldn't make the session today, so we'll have the link to the presentation as well. So we'll share that as well. It'll be a private link, so you can get in and just go through it again. I think it was quite like the way it was presented was really really insightful, and certainly simplified it, but also demonstrated or showed the the amount of stuff you need to navigate as well. I suppose there's so many different options, but as a small business, keep it simple. Look at what you're doing, and there are things that you can do straight away, and then just work towards putting a roadmap together.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a really good point, Frank. Keep it simple to start with. This is a process you'll come back and revisit again and again and again. It may well seem overwhelming, but yeah, just keep it simple. Obviously, focusing on your scope 1 and scope 2, what you can do directly, and then yes, look beyond your own boundaries. But your starting point is what can I do? What can I manage directly? But definitely need to be looking over the fence as to what's happening upstream and downstream. And there are support programs out there, and there's a range of funding initiatives and financial support out there that you could tap into to help you with some of those reduction programs.
Great, fantastic. All right, well, and then thanks everyone. Thanks again to David and for Ian for putting this on, and providing some really good insight into this area. And again, look forward to continuing the journey. We are doing a little bit of work on the side on this, as I've mentioned earlier, and we've got a small group of people that are working on some potential projects, not just net zero, but also around waste and that sort of stuff. So we'll keep you informed as we progress with that. But any questions, just shoot them through. I'll send the link through probably later today or tomorrow for the video presentation, also a copy of the presentation as well. And yeah, just be no issues in reaching out directly to David or Ian or to myself. So at that point, I'll close it off and say thank you very much for attending. And if I don't speak to you beforehand, I think probably most of you will, but anyway, if I don't, have a good Christmas. And yeah, and just keep an eye on this space. I think there'll be a lot more coming through certainly from our end. So see you later, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.